We are here to discuss community decision making, and I think I'm going to mostly um, let Caroline do the stuff. Um, I've got a few things I would like to make sure get kind of poked at, but mostly I'm pretty open. Um, Given that this is largely a recording for posterity and for gathering folks. Caroline, would you introduce, I guess, your background with community decision making and collective organizations and yeah.
Sure. And when Deacon says that I will be leading or doing the thing, that thing remains largely undefined at this point. So
Yeah. I can do that stuff, but
directing.
Yeah, the directing thing. But for now, okay. Let's just start with, you've done a bunch of work in this area, so let's talk about that.
Well, I've spent a lot of hours of my life in collective consensus-based meetings. This is a fact. Yeah, when I was in college, when I was about 20 years old, coming out of a background as an activist, like a social justice activist, I got really into direct action collectives, which are collective organizations, oftentimes loosely organizations, in which people engage in a horizontal decision-making framework to meet shared needs directly, and also to engage political action in some cases directly. So direct participation is a principle of design in all of these groups. And so I was living in Pittsburgh, PA at the time. And when I discovered this model, I recognized that it felt more empowering to be a part of than top-down nonprofit industrial complex experiences that I had had. So I went to as many, like I tried to kind of experience as many of these collectives as I could. In the summer between sophomore and junior year of college, I was a part of, nominally in some cases, like 8 or 9 different collectives. I don't actually remember them all, or I could if I really tried. I could sit here and list them all, but basically different, like the book, the Anarchist Bookshop, and the Books to Prisoners program, and the Bicycle Collective, and the Anarchist Organizing Committee, the political, what were they called? They were called POG, Pittsburgh Organizing Group, which is now defunct. Yeah, and because I just like really enjoyed consensus decision making at the time too. I will note that I had been involved in filmmaking for 7 years at that point. And decision making in filmmaking is very collaborative. It's very consultative. It's like everybody brings different talents. And so I was kind of looking for that, I think, in my surroundings, and I was not finding it in a lot of entry-level jobs, right? Where you're basically just a tool. And so I really was looking for experiences that, engaged me, engaged my point of view, engaged my talents to, actually co-create something. And that's what I found in these collective contexts. So it's hard to enumerate because it's kind of nonlinear, but I spent about 7 years with this one collective that had the most functional consensus of all of them, which was Freeride, the bicycle collective. Also, I will say, when I was 23, I traveled the US and also traveled across Mexico and was interviewing collectives about their best practices and about successes and failures that I had looked up in the back of the Slingshot journal. So I just like showed up at these places and was like, hey, tell me your story. I'm Caroline, I'm from Freeride. So that was fun. But yeah, I just absorbed a lot about best practices, and I was really interested in why consensus process felt empowering to be a part of in many cases, but in many cases it felt disempowering. And so I was curious and teasing out why some groups failed to, enact empowering structures and why some groups were having success. And so Free Ride was the most functional of all the Pittsburgh consensus groups at the time, in my experience. And so I stuck around on the volunteer council. Free Ride is a bicycle collective that accepts donations of unwanted bicycles, allows people to refurbish them and get them back on the road. And the way it was structured is volunteers could earn a bike by volunteering, and people could pay for just about anything except for new parts through volunteer hours. So it was all volunteer run. There was a collective council, which was simply people who had volunteered a certain amount of hours per month, and they came to meetings, and that was it, that they were on the council. And so they made decisions on behalf of the organization, and it was very participatory. Because we were all actually in the shop helping people doing stuff, we all, put our inputs together to make decisions and to create proposals. And I ended up getting a job with Free Ride. The only paid position was as a teacher. So as a contract worker, I was also a teacher with Free Ride, and that allowed me to stick around and be really involved as well for that amount of time. And then in 2011, I began training to become a cooperative business development practitioner, which is somebody who helps start up co-ops, which was a great fit for my passions about the collectives in general, collective models and best practices, which I didn't even learn the term best practices until like years later. I was just really fascinated, I guess, personally, by this sense of like what was empowering and what was disempowering in these contexts. So, which is kind of a qualitative thing, but oftentimes can trace back to like practicing certain norms or not and things like that. So, so yeah, I've consulted with like probably a dozen or more co-ops in my career, all different kinds, some more radical than others. Yeah, I don't know. Is that enough of a background? Oh, I think you're muted, Deacon. Deacon, we can't hear you.
Yeah, there we go. I muted myself so that my background noise wouldn't interrupt. But yeah, that's a bunch. I've heard about a bunch of those things, but a few of those things were even a bit new to me, or at least the dates and things like didn't realize some of it. But yeah, no, it's awesome. Does anybody else have any direct questions or responses to any of that? Or do you know any of those places or organizations?
It's mostly Pittsburgh. I moved to Denver, 6 years ago? 7, 6?
It's been longer than that. Yeah, longer than 6, I think. Or maybe, yeah, I don't know, somewhere in there. Cool, awesome. And I have similar organizing background, not nearly as focused on co-op development, but never been an anarchist, always been the oddball out in anarchist groups, like the token non-anarchist dude. And
who kept showing up to anarchist contexts.
Yeah. I mean, it's like
that's great.
And I feel like across the board I've been generally welcome, because very quickly anarchists in Denver realized I was a workhorse. And so it's just like, we'll let him hang out, he does stuff, like he'll get everything done, and we'll forgive the fact that he like explicitly believes that hierarchy is valuable. So but yeah, so just doing my part to shake things up, keep everybody on their toes. So I've also been a part of consensus decision-making processes that succeeded and were like gorgeous and elegant, and also some that failed. Also, obviously, been a part of hierarchical decision-making that has been positive and successful, and much that has been really toxic and awful. And famously in Denver, there was a fantastic consensus decision-making body that came out of the anti-war movement, and ended up becoming like kind of the general organizing consensus body. Is the Denver Spokes Council that like that came out of that early Bush era anti-war movement, and worked on the Transform Columbus Day campaign and immigrants' rights and all these different things, that was crushed in one evening when representatives of an organization I won't name decided to shatter the consensus by going behind everybody's back and making a deal with the DPD that was not consensused upon, and everything fell apart. And that was before he moved to Denver.
Ooh, that sounds horrific.
It was bad. It was really bad. You know, so I've seen, you know, that kind of failure too, you know, and it can.
Yeah, me too.
When the thing that fails is that that consensus ends, and it was the promise. You know, the hierarchical things can work, but when it's not what people signed up for, it's no good. Which is a pretty big component of why I've been so explicit about my intentions for favor, so that everybody knows what they're signing up for when they sign up, because you have to have consent. You know, whether there's consensus decision making or benevolent dictatorship or whatever, if there's no consent, it's ugly. So we're getting into it. I dug through some of the handouts that you had grouped for helping to inform people about this kind of decision making, and there seemed to be a few big components in terms of source, like some themes in terms of source material. Would you give just maybe like just a brief background of like the historical precedent for horizontal decision making, and like the big wins through history that matter to you?
I'm not sure how to answer the second part of that question, but I can speak to my understanding of the origins of the consensus process and how it kind of how it gained a certain cultural vein in the US and around the world, in the, you know, from the, you know, activist organizing frameworks. So anyway, so my understanding of the history around consensus, the process, is that the Quakers, which were a religious movement that is really focused on the dignity of every human being and really prioritized people having a lot of space to like voice whatever was coming up for them or through them. You know, that was kind of their understanding or interpretation of God, is that you know, it's like expressed through us. And so they're famous for having really long meetings, sometimes in which like the whole point of the meeting is to sit in silence for an hour or more. So that's the Quakers. Definitely look them up. They are fascinating and super cool and involved in a lot of like, you know, anti-war, various kinds of, you know, activist movements. But they developed the model, but they based it off of what they had studied and observed from the Iroquois 7-Nation Confederacy, which is the, you know, Native American Confederacy group of 7 nations that's kind of located in like the Pennsylvania, upstate New York kind of region, which the Quakers are also ended up being based in Pennsylvania and in that region. And then as far as like the modern version of consensus, that came out of the anti-nuclear movement in the 60s, where they were introduced to the model by Quakers and really picked up on it and used it extensively. And the political logic behind consensus is that it is prefigurative, in the sense that we are trying to model the world that we want to exist. So the world that we want to exist is one where everyone has equal stake, equal ability to participate fully, and is listened to and is, you know, involved in decision making. And so that's where like horizontal decision making really picked up steam, and since has, you know, spread It's used in a variety of contexts, oftentimes direct action organizing contexts. But yeah, it comes out of this kind of values place, or, you know, an ethics place around equal access to power in decision making. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, so that's excellent. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Those are fantastic examples to touch on. If trying to think if I would add anything to that, it would probably be just a nod toward Catalonia and the model of consensus developed by the anarcho-syndicalists there, and it is a horizontal decision-making structure, but also a spokes council structure. So not every member of the body is present for decision-making, but every group of people sends a spoke, a representative, to speak on their behalf, and the spokes council makes decisions by consensus. And that's a model that I've used, I referenced it before, that I have found to be very effective for large groups of people. And sometimes even if you have a good facilitator for, you know, a few hundred people to make very hard decisions in a very small span of time, I've seen it work, and it's amazing.
Yeah, I don't have as much direct experience with larger group decision making. However, I was just reading last night an article by Tom Atlee that Adam had linked into a previous Google Drive folder for a permaculture design course, and I just found it by searching for something else.
Mm-hmm.
But it's about citizen deliberative councils.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also, from what I was reading, a strategy for like kind of effective, fast deliberation and decision making across a lot of diversity and in controversial contexts. Yeah. So anyway, I continue to learn every day. So thanks for bringing that up too. I'd love to look more into that Catalonia model. What was the time frame in which that was emerging?
30s.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Yeah.
Same time as the Bavarian. So Bavaria and Catalonia seceded at about the same time, and were both crushed by fascists. Not for lack of their model being functional and the mutual support. Like what was happening within their communities was building, and there was a lot of thriving, but they didn't have the same resources as the international, the rise of the Axis and the industrial machine behind the Axis, even before the war reignited World War II, was huge. And of course, after Germany crushed the Bavarian Revolution, they committed troops to Spain to help crush the Catalonian, secession movement, and then they were fighting a foreign war and a civil war at the same time. There was no chance. So, but anyway, that's not exactly the point. Bringing this down to the particular of the favor, we've got this really, I think it's a really rich, cool situation. So for those who haven't been kind of like in on the favor discussions, so like I kind of like as an individual established the favor, right? So the existence of the favor right now is by benevolent, I believe, dictatorship of one, right? So I make all the decisions. I wrote the original agreement, and everybody who's come into the network has agreed to it. So in that way, it's dictatorial and also consensus-based, because I've committed not to change the rules for the duration of phase one, and everyone is committed to accept those rules. So you can have like kind of like not tyranny, but absolute hierarchy and consensus at the same time. But the cost of that is nothing can change, because, if I were to change something, I would have to, I would decide to change it, then I would run around and maybe get consent from everybody. It gets kind of unwieldy. So to have consensus and unilateral authority at the same time, you end up with a very stagnant or sluggish system. right? So at the same time that I made what I considered to be the minimum viable decisions for the network so that I could achieve consensus of onboarding, I wrote a list of questions that I believe are going to be critical to grow the network, but that weren't critical just to establish it, to get started. So it's working right now. People are making exchanges. Goods and services are being transacted. But it has to stay kind of small. We can't really incorporate organizations. We can't change people's credit limits. We're kind of crossing our fingers and hoping nobody defaults, because the decision making necessary to make those things possible hasn't been carried out. But it's been like openly, transparently not carried out, right? So it's not like being swept under the rug. We're saying, here are all the things we don't know. We're going to decide them before we move into this next phase. Or we're going to decide how we decide them before we move into the next phase. And then in the next phase, we're going to decide them. So the proposal with the favor is that it's in phase 1 now, and it'll move to phase 2 as soon as the entire body of members comes to consensus about how it will decide how credit limits are changed, whether or not credit limits change. I've actually got the list right here in front of me. What constitutes a quorum? So does every member have to be present and verbally weigh in on every decision? Or can people like silently stand aside? Like just say, I'm not gonna show up to the meeting, whatever gets decided, it's fine, it's okay without me. And then how many members would have to be in a meeting or in on a discussion for that decision to be valid? What technologies can be used for communication? So that affects pacing, it affects accessibility, it affects even like transparency, and like there are a lot of different things that come into play there. What is the nature of stand-asides? There are different kinds of stand-asides that I've seen in different organizations I've worked with. And that means there's like, I don't agree, but I'm not gonna block it, that kind of thing. So like the biggest difference is like whether it's silent or not, like not showing up to the meeting, is that a stand-aside? Or does a decision have to be tentative until everyone has the option? The other big difference is, do stand-asides have to be addressed? When somebody says, I've been in organizations where if someone doesn't say yay, they don't necessarily block an issue, but it is explicitly meant and communicated that if you're standing aside, you have to, or you have kind of a right and obligation sort of thing to communicate why it is that you're not in or blocking, and everybody has to listen and address whatever concerns you have before a decision moves forward. So every stand aside has to be addressed. That's a possible decision. And then how will new members be invited? Right now, I'm inviting people, and people are telling me who they would like in the network, and I'm like, no, and so far I haven't said no to anybody, but I'm reserving the right to, right? And so it's just me deciding who gets to be in and who doesn't. And that doesn't scale well. It doesn't scale like elegantly or mutually beneficial. You guys get it. So that has to be changed. But not everybody is a good fit, right? Even people we might like. It's like there's a person I know who works for an insurance company, and he does great work. He has a wonderful, loving family, and he doesn't have anything commercially to offer as an individual, goods or service-wise, and he doesn't want to. So I love him. I'm not going to invite him, right? And so, like, we have to make those decisions about what's the criteria, and what are the obligations of membership. So, what's the criteria coming in, and then what is a person obligated to, and then also consenting on so right now I've established some rules that I believe most or all of should be permanent, like unchangeable, as like it's the Constitution. And I would actually assert that some elements of the Constitution like should be incredibly difficult to amend, if not impossible, right? Like that the system is zero sum, or that there's no interest. Like it would break the whole system if there was interest on debt. that would be terrible, can't change ever. And so the group as a whole has to decide how it wants to handle what can be changed and what can't. Um, and that's pretty much. And then yeah, just any other details of what consensus decision making means for this group, and how it can be changed. Because also the actual decision making model, and this is what I see as the split between phase 2 and phase 3, is that if the network grows, it might be important for it to either split and subdivide, or for decisions to not be consensus of all members. But that decision isn't up to me. That's like a phase 3 thing. So it gets to be decided by the phase 2 members. Certainly not a thing I need to decide right now. So those are hard decisions. And those are just the decisions about decision making, really, or mostly. The decisions it would take, there's like the decisions that are about decision making, and then the decisions that would be necessary to initiate phase 2, which are quasi about, like how members get invited. That's kind of about decision making, because as soon as we enter into phase 2, it can't just be a free for all in terms of invitations. So it's kind of also a decision about decision making. And then after the decisions about decision making, phase 2 begins, and then there are a whole bucket of other decisions. And so, you know, community decision making, it seems like it's like a lot of work. The hypothetical payoff is we get a tool that exists as a peer to the US dollar. So that's like the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. That's not even much of a stretch of metaphor there. Like, if we have a tool that for a community of people serves the basic function of the dollar, but doesn't have any of the extractive mechanics of the dollar, like, that's a huge win for everyone involved. So, you know, that's essentially what's on the table. What do you guys think about all that? And hi, Elizabeth, I saw you jump in.
So defining what winning looks like defining what we're after is what will allow people to opt in or opt out of that mission. Defining values will also allow people to decide if this is for them. So that's kind of a meta, it's like it's a pre-decision, is whether I want to be a part of this.
Absolutely.
And so, you know, that and those kind of questions of where we're going, what we value, is shaped, there's a culture that forms around that, a culture that's like informal, invisible, interpersonal, and the culture shapes the outcomes, certainly, and can shape the structures. But then as far as the structures, right, like, decision making is a kind of technology that allows us to do what we set out to do, right? And then there's the technologies that are, you know, digital, collaborative, whatever, that can help us accomplish what we want to set out to do. And those will shape outcomes as well. So, like, when we're making a decision about technology, it's fraught with a lot of implications we probably won't be able to see right away, around like how discourse will flow in this, you know, through this venue or whatever, and what, like you mentioned, pacing and things like that. So yeah, consensus, the reason I was involved in consensus decision-making groups for so many years is not because I like to punish myself. It's because those contexts are actually quite energizing and quite vitalizing when they're done well. And so these matters of pace and culture, like, they actually have everything to do with whether people stick around or people get disenfranchised, burnt out, pissed off, like aggravated enough to not keep participating. So there's this balance between what we want to do and how we get there, mm-hmm. and not have the how we get there be so, you know, painful that we stop the journey of whatever we're after.
I want to pause us for a minute just to acknowledge a couple, just like some like temperature checking things. So one thing I noticed is that 4 of us here are in the favor network, or I guess Cal, you're scheduled for an onboarding, right? Or tentatively at. And then
Yeah.
Dan and Naveed, you're not in the network as yet. What does, so for the people who are, so for Dan and Naveed, and then I guess next Cal, like we're not in, but are obviously have shown up, maybe just out of interest in talking about decision making. What does the weight of this, or the presentation so far of this big group decision making task feel like as it was described?
I'll start us off, Dan. I'll start me off, I mean, and you can start yourself off. Yeah, I'm here because I was at Anders' house yesterday, and I was picking up some sunchokes for Caroline in the Skyland home. And then he's like, hey, I have, do you want some eggs? I'm like, sure. He had these duck eggs. And he gave me 6 of them, which I shared with my family in Lakewood and my farm friends. I didn't bring you any eggs, Caroline, because I was considering the fact that it would be going long distances on the scooter and they may not make it. But he told me that in the future, I'll be officially selling these eggs for half a favor. And I was like, I was intrigued and I had heard about this. So that's what brought me here tonight. And then I'm a big fan of Caroline's as well. Anytime that she speaks, I tend to listen. Right now, it does feel a little heavy in terms of your question about like the consensus making. I do see, like, I'm glad you self-described or someone else described you as a workhorse, Deacon, because when I see you in action, I'm like, oh yeah, like I kind of just like the idea of letting you do your thing. Yeah, so I just needed to take sometime, like when I'm with you, there's so much rich information, and I often just like need to take a breath afterwards. So I'm kind of just like getting up to your gear is an effort. I'm not sure still how the consensus decision making feels for me, because my examples of it are very limited. They've been in Extinction Rebellion, which it didn't turn out well in the version that I saw, and then they were on this past Sunday's call, which, you know, I think was like just a taste of it, but still I would say it like I didn't see the benefits of it flowing quite yet.
Gotcha.
Did that help answer your questions at all?
Absolutely. That was all, yeah, it's very rich. Thank you. Dan, do you want to speak to some of this? What are your impressions?
Well, I think that I don't know a lot about what the current state of the favor system. I don't know how many people are currently onboarded. I know a lot of the people on this, well, actually all the people on this meeting, but I didn't know that everybody was a part of this or who was a part of this, right? So I think that involved has of impact on how you go about making decisions. I'll also say in response to what Naveed just said, there's a difference between participating in the decision and coming up with the ideas. So like you could have one person who knows a lot of stuff about whatever you're deciding come up with a suggestion, and then everybody is like, oh yeah, that sounds good, or I have a problem with this. It doesn't necessarily, so you can include people in the decision making who aren't necessarily comfortable with the idea generation, and that might make it easier. It was just something that occurred to me. I also know you gave an example earlier.
Oh, you froze.
About the anti-war group. What's that?
You broke up a little bit, at least for me. I don't know for everybody. When you said you gave an example earlier.
My internet connection is a little strange right now.
Okay, cool. But you said you gave an example earlier?
I said you gave an example of the anti-war group helping somebody undermine the consensus process. And I think that's the big potential weakness, right? Is that somebody with ill will can very easily break the whole system. So I don't know how you build in resilience against that. That would be one thing I would wonder about.
Yeah, it's hard. Cal, do you have thoughts? So Cal has scheduled an onboarding coming into the favor, but isn't in the network yet. So what are your thoughts? Does this seem like it makes it sound like daunting to come in, or does it pique your interest more, or I don't know, whatever. What are you thinking?
Yeah, me personally, I'm game. I mean, it sounds manageable. What I would liken it to is I was just talking with a friend of mine about polyamory and like what that looks like when you're really engaging in it fully. And like at the end of the day, you can really see a lot of benefit from that type of relationship. And if that's what you want to do as an alternative to monogamy, there's all sorts of positive traits to it. But the thing about it that I think is really important to point out is that we are talking about a way different and a lot of times way more significant workload. The emotional labor and time that goes into a relationship that involves three people is seriously different than a traditional monogamy that is just two people, where like the kind of ground rules are already laid out and they're understood, and everyone has tons of role models and they have good examples and bad examples and culture and their parents and family, whatever. And it is really hard to come up with all these new answers on your own, like, because that's really what it is when you're in kind of a poly world. It's like you get to design the whole thing from scratch based on who you are and what you want this thing to be. Brilliant. Could be really cool for some people. Also, you have to recognize the fact that it is a lot of work, and some people like have to understand that they might not have the capacity to do that work. Favor seems similar to me in that way, where it might just be too much for some people to engage with because of this process for coming to a conclusion, making decisions about all sorts of elements of favor. That might be more than a lot of people want to engage with, because, and it's also like kind of murky because we're talking about people's skills and like very individual kind of abstract things. So it can get kind of gray and fuzzy a lot of the time, is what I'm predicting. I'm down. I want to try. I think that's cool. But that's what I would say objectively about the system and how other people would probably perceive it. Like when you're breaking all this down, it's like, whoa, this is, yeah, daunting seems like a fair word for it.
Awesome. And Elizabeth, you have, you joined recently. I guess everybody joined recently because it's not very old. How does the decision-making and the prospect of being kind of on the hook for...
Ignore that chat message. I was just trying to take notes because I don't want to lose the thoughts I have. Just ignore it. I'm going to take notes elsewhere.
But how does the prospect of being a part of a decision-making body sit with you, and all the things? What are your impressions?
About the decision-making? It sounds like it's not about favor as a whole, but about the decision-making process, right?
Unless you have like a really salient, something bubbling up about favor in general, but yeah, we're talking about the decision-making.
Yeah, I have something bubbling up, but I will save it.
Okay.
I'm honestly exhausted by our decision-making process from Sunday. I think that I like Dan's distinction between generating ideas and then making the decision. I think what I was excited about and why I wanted to join Favor and why I was happy to be invited into the decision-making process is because I have a background in alternative currencies, right? I've spent time in academic settings researching this, and I've spent time with like local groups in Baltimore figuring out like, well, what does this mean when we're trying to have kind of this system next to the monetary system? How do we do this? And so I feel comfortable being part of that decision process better than I would feel comfortable being part of a decision-making process, say, about like decision-making processes, right? Because I don't have training in that, you know, like I'm stepping up as a leader in the mediation field because that's my expertise. I should be a part of that decision-making process.
Sure.
Do I think everyone should be a part of that decision-making process? Absolutely not. Do I think every mediator should have a say? No, like absolutely not. I would be comfortable being a malevolent dictator of that. I really would. I wouldn't even call it malevolent. I would say I was stepping into my responsibility as a competent person in this field. And so it makes me very comfortable that you've made all the decisions because I trust your competency. I know you, I have some idea of your background. If I didn't know you, if someone walked up to me and said like, I have these decisions about how we're gonna make a monetary system, I'd be like, and you are who exactly? I would not consent to that. So it's easy to consent because I know you, because I trust you, because we built a relationship, because I have an idea of your background. The people making in the decision-making process need to have that foundation. And what I think I saw yesterday, or not yesterday, Sunday fall apart, is there was no effort to build that trust. No effort to really, it's really hard to scale relationships in a group of 30 people. And so when you don't have those things in place, I think it makes it hard to have a decision-making process. I would not trust Deacon. Like if we were like in a decision-making process and Dan, who started today, I'm assuming was like, I am equal to your vote. I'd be like, no, you're not. You don't know what's going on. You can't make the decision, right? Deacon and I might be able to make the decision. But if you're going to count the decision of like, and no offense, Dan, I'm not calling you an amateur. I'm just saying like, there are amateurs, there are people who are new, there are people who are not in the field. They shouldn't be making decisions. They shouldn't be generating ideas. They shouldn't have a vote. When you're taking care of this, I really, every time you say I'm a malevolent dictator, I'm like, this is irritating. Like,
Benevolent.
Malevolent. I'm like, for fuck's sake, Deacon, like when you do step up and take responsibility and say like, I have expertise in this, I have an idea of what it needs to be. That's so much more soothing than saying, Elizabeth, what ideas would you like to include? I'm like, this is not my baby. This is your baby. Sure. Like, I don't know what your baby is. I don't know how to take care of your baby. I didn't make the baby with you. Like, I can hold your baby and think it's cute and blah, 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 but like, you ultimately have to decide what it's fed, what schools it goes to. Like, I don't want a part of that.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think that this decision-making process, I think Caroline mentioned, you know, we can get stuck in the how and actually not do the what. Mm-hmm. And I'm feeling very stuck in the how, and I'm sort of just like, what do we need to do? Like, just tell me what you want me to do. I trust you. I'll freaking try.
All right. Oh, it sounds really good. So just quick retraction for the internet's sake. I do not represent myself as a malevolent dictator. I aspire to be the most benevolent of benevolent dictators I can be. And it's interesting actually, because this varies, the notion of this varies from community to community that I've been in. So like for instance, in the software world, benevolent dictation is like a term that's used frequently, and B, a thing that's perfectly respected, right? You know, when you look at a lot of projects, you know, like benevolent dictator for life is just a term, like a title that people will just have on a project or whatever. And generally it's just like, oh, cool, that's just how this is governed. That means there's a certain expectation for pacing, a certain expectation for responsibilities, and et cetera, blah, 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 blah. And then, you know, obviously, I'm in, you know, the Karate Kachori Ryu, this old style, this classical martial arts system that is very meritocratic. And actually, I was thinking about as like I was like ramping up for this tonight's thing, I think it was while I was in the shower, I was thinking about meritocracy as it relates to this, and realized actually I've been in a meritocratic educational institution, one or another, several different ones, for the last 30 years. And I was thinking about like how much that's impacted my perspective, because I talk to people about education and education policy a lot. And I talk with teachers about like setting certain standards, and they're like, well, kids can't meet those standards. And I'm like, that's fine. Your class is a privilege. Like they'll meet the standards, they won't be in it. And a lot of the teachers I speak with are like teachers in public schools and things. And they're like, you can't do that. You can't just throw a kid out of the class. And I'm just like, what? Because it's not a part of my world. I've never, like, not since I was in the 3rd grade have I been in a classroom that wasn't a privilege, that you didn't have to earn your way into, or in some cases they were invite only. My 4th, 5th, and 6th grade years were in an invite only system that you could easily be thrown out of and you couldn't even apply to, you know. And then since then I've been in these other institutions, and that dynamic I think that Elizabeth is talking about, where there's those kinds of environments create an aspiration of leveling up, is like becoming more and more rare. And I think a lot of times, you know, I notice also like the tyranny of structurelessness. We've talked about it some here and there, and it's also in the course of like the SPDC, even though we've talked about it and acknowledged it, it's kind of crept in to some aspects, and I think it's a thing that definitely bugs Elizabeth. When you don't have, yes, we got two strong nods there. When you don't have an implicit structure to your meritocracy or your hierarchy or your decision making, that doesn't mean they don't develop and don't creep in. That's the whole idea of the tyranny of structurelessness. And so sometimes I'll hear complaints or like skepticism about like the hierarchy in the Krakatoa, and especially like, that's my martial arts school. And I've been in a lot of Kung Fu schools from China. They follow the temple model where the hierarchy is obscured. When you're in a class, everybody is the same. They're all either wearing no uniform at all, or they're the exact same uniform, and you can't really, and you're just in it and you're just practicing, right? And what's really, really interesting is it takes a month or two of diligently showing up to classes to have any idea what the hierarchy is. But when you do see it, it is so much more embedded and so much more like nuanced, and in some cases insidious, than any transparent hierarchy. And so it's a really interesting thing. And I think to the point of how do we avoid that toxicity? How do we avoid someone coming in and shattering the consensus model? My belief and my impression is mostly that it's done through structure, and that's my reasoning for having this list, this like very solid bullet pointed list of what it will take to get to consensus. It's like a dozen things. And if all 12 of those things haven't been consented upon by the body of people, then that body of people isn't capable of taking on consensus. So no other decisions can be made, or all the other decisions would have to be made by me until a body of people can consent on these things. And at that point, there's structure, because that list of things is the list of things that create structure. It's what constitutes a quorum. It's all of how people get in and out. If that structure is implicit, not even implicit, explicit. If it's explicit and clearly spelled out from the beginning, then it becomes a lot harder to for like little shadow governments to form, which frequently form around decision making. And there was a guy that was in, I'm gonna grab it, a collective that I was a part of years ago, who went on to write a book. I thought I could see it, but it was a different similar book called Come Hell or High Water, which is just about anarchist decision making. And it details like all of these interpersonal machinations that form in anarchist communities that are not in spirit anarchistic, that create shadow hierarchies. And we want to avoid that. So yeah, any thoughts on any of that? Because I think that it would be kind of fun to take one of these bullet points and workshop it for a minute, so we have a little bit of the meat that Elizabeth was talking about.
But I have so many thoughts. Okay, I've been quiet for the last 20 minutes. I really need to share some responses to this. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I want to speak to all the things, and I took notes. I will try to go backwards in the notes to touch on things. So regarding what you just spoke to, Deacon, about shadow hierarchies, in the leadership and cooperative organizations training that I just gave, I discuss what leadership looks like when played out in a horizontal framework is being able to really attend to the conditions in which decision-making and activity is happening. Being able to really carefully care for the culture and the structures that are playing out, because anything, yes, many things can undermine these structures. So it's really being aware of best practices, able to intervene and get people back into best practices when things are going off the rails in terms of unhealthy conduct, right? So that's just to speak to that thing right there. And I want to talk also about stakeholdership versus leadership, because what Elizabeth's comments were really getting at for me was distinguishing between stakeholder and leader. So there's a participatory element inherent in the design of favor, which is that anyone who is in the system can spend favor however they want within the rules of favor. So that generates stakeholdership. But what defines leadership in this context? What's the criteria for somebody who maybe should be empowered with decision making is a different thing. And so the things that were coming up were competence, expertise, commitment level. Those could be considered criteria for selecting leaders within the group of stakeholders. A person can be a stakeholder and a leader, but it is important to distinguish these things, I think. And so that's kind of what it sounds like we're getting at, is that we're interested in those structures where there might be different levels of commitment and different activities, therefore. Around the questions that you articulated, Deacon, what came up for me is that, yes, somebody with organizational policy, structural expertise might be able to make a proposal, generate the idea, right, as was talked about as well. And then the whole group could at least consent to it. And that's where the stakeholder thing comes in. It's stakeholders, ideally, we should be obtaining consent. But unless there's a real burning value-based need to use the consensus process, then we don't have to use the consensus process. We can actually design a different structure here. So competence-based leadership, relevant for consent by all, because all have a stake, unless we have a value. I just said that. Okay, I'm just scanning through my notes backwards. Okay, the other thing that's really interesting to me about favor is, unlike just about any other group I've ever been a part of that's consensus or not or whatever, favor is, in terms of what it's doing, it's more, it's a currency. It's more about performing a function in communities than anything else. And so it's not an ideologically based organization or a mission-based organization even. You could argue, there might be some objectives of favor that we can articulate as a particular community. But also favor is kind of just a mechanism. It's a function in terms of what it does. And so one of the criteria we could use in decision-making, and this touches on something Asia brought up this weekend around defining criteria as a lens for filtering what proposals might qualify here. One of the criteria can be, is the function of favor preserved in this decision, right? And that can be used for all time, throughout the whole life cycle of favor, as one of the criteria that, or policies, right, that whatever council or decision-making body is using to examine decisions. So Yeah, that's a lot of things, but those are all my notes. Check. Yeah.
I did want to plug this text. This is Come Hell or High Water. It is
You want to let me borrow it?
I kind of don't. I only have the one copy, and it's very dear to me.
It looks short.
It's not long, but it's full of all these cute cartoons. And if you happen to have any like zines from me from like 2003, 2004, you see similar cartoons, because the cartoonist is the collective member that I was living with who went off to, anyway, it's a fascinating book on collectivity and
Great.
toxicity in those, between co-operators. And yeah, anyway, Come Hell or High Water, book plug. I think that's the only book plug so far in this episode of The Favor. I think that there's like a minimum of like 4 book plugs per episode of Favor Fireside. So we got to get like 3 more.
I would also like to plug, and it's only relevant to the people who are in this room right now, because most people, people who might watch this recording might not be a part of the social permaculture course, but I want to plug the Leadership in Cooperative Organizations workshop, because it's really about how do we manage the complexity of trying to do things horizontally, like really skillfully, and actually make for great outcomes, make for empowering experiences.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. Would you guys be game to workshop one of these decisions? It's not for keeps, but for pedagogy. Let's workshop one of these decisions and see how it goes. How does that feel for everybody?
Are you trying to generate ideas, like proposals, or actually make it, like do that and make a decision?
I'm trying to generate an example.
Oh, okay, great. Yes,
how,
let's do it.
How many implications and sticky points and things can come up with figuring out these things, these kinds of tough constitutional matters. Yeah, that's it. What do you guys think? You good? All right. Did any of the decisions stand out to anybody as like particularly like sexy? Naveed's laughing, so I'm thinking Naveed.
I was laughing because I couldn't recall any of them, so I need to hear them again, or I trust you to choose one.
Yeah, so apparently none of them are sexy decisions because they're all forgettable questions. All right, cool. We've got several questions around the quorum and stand-asides and that, and then there's how discussion takes place, technology and that kind of thing. And then there's new member invitations and credit limits. Those are the big subjects.
There might be a meta one about whether a specific council would have, special empowerments to make decisions, or whether all people make decisions equally. Or whether there's even multiple committees that work collaboratively. So that might be a little too complex to dive into fully, but.
I kind of like that one.
Yeah, you like that one?
Yeah, if I were to put a vote in for any of them, that one sounds good.
Yeah, I want to throw one in, but it's just to like poke Deacon. Maybe we should have interest, Deacon. Why are you so anti-interest?
If you guys want to talk about it, we can talk about that. No? Okay, no, out of scope. But
not in the expertise that I have to even meaningfully participate. Speaking to your comment, Elizabeth, from earlier.
Yeah, but we can totally have that conversation. I'm super into it.
I'd have to fake being for interest, but like we could do it.
So here's what's really weird. I'm not anti-interest. I'm pro-interest. I don't think this tool should include interest.
I see.
I don't think monetary issuance should include interest. I think that interest-bearing loans, like VC style, like Shark Tank shit, like are good for people.
Okay.
as long as they have no connection to how money gets created.
Ah.
So that's my short answer there. So we can put a pin in that and come
Yeah,
back.
so I see how, like, because I was like, maybe you could do like a quick thing to just get everyone on the same page about interest, but yeah, no, there's too much in there.
There's a lot in there, but that could be a whole episode about like holistic use of interest and in economics. Yeah, like
That would be a fun episode or like a fun debate to have, but it would have to be like everyone would need to be able to do that, which is also why I'm going to say I veto decision making as a thing we're going to talk about, because I don't know enough about collaborative decision making to have like an opinion on that.
Okay. What about like how about just inviting? The invitation process. That seems
what I like. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds great.
As a non-new member, as a member that's wanting to be invited because I want to be a part of the club.
See, Naveed could be a malevolent plant right now. He could just tear the whole system down because he's brand new. We don't know.
Bad faith actor.
All right.
Trying to come in and steal all the favor and just suck it all out of the system.
But yeah, invites seems very relevant to the moment, and it seems like something we could probably all speak to. So that one sounds, I like that too.
Sweet. Let's do some brainstorming about everything. Let's just throw out shit that has to do with inviting people.
And are we talking about phase 2? Like
invites in general, just the idea of inviting people into the network.
Before I do that, Deacon, can you talk about how inviting people has been going, just so we kind of know what already exists? Like I'm biased in that I feel like brainstorming and mediation is like the 4th of the 5 steps. And so every time you are all like, let's brainstorm, I'm like, well, wait a second, like there's no context. I have no idea what the criteria is. I don't know what the goal is. This is like 10 steps ahead of where I want to be.
All right.
So start at step 1, which is like, what is happening with inviting? That would help.
Yeah, totally. I can actually exhaustively explain what's happening with inviting because there are so few members. So I invited myself because I created this tool because I want to use it. I invited Drew because Drew provides services that I want to pay him for in favor. And so I invited Drew and then immediately paid him with the currency I created to do shit for me. And he was stoked about it. And
brilliant.
He's sitting pretty on a ton of favor. Y'all should hire Drew. Or do things for Drew. I'm sorry. Yeah. Do things for Drew. He'll pay you in favor. He likes food. Anyway, talk to Drew about what he likes. I also invited Caroline. Drew needed things from Caroline. Right? I invited Sven. I think that was like his first thing. Or you needed things from Drew. He needed people need stuff. So that was like the very beginning, was people that I knew had immediate business with me or adjacent to me, right? So that's like how I got the ball rolling. I invited Sven. Sven is one of my longest time clients, and also the only client of mine, not the only actually, that's wrong. He's one of the only clients I have who I am also a client of, right? So we do business, like for the last over a decade, we've done business back and forth together. I love doing business with Sven and Celine. So I brought him into the network. Ironically, he hasn't done any trades yet. Ona is my girlfriend. Adam Brock joined for obvious similar reasons, doing business with Drew and Caroline and myself, and we do projects together. It seems to be a pattern in our lives. Anders is a client of mine, and also obviously in the SBDC. Invited him in, and then Elizabeth came on board, is paying the dojo in favor, and then brought on board someone she wanted to do business with, or told me that I should invite somebody. I interviewed them, felt fully confident in that person. First, also, I Googled that person. I Googled them, looked them up, read about their certifications, and so I felt confident. That was the first person in the network I didn't know. So I wanted to feel confident that she had a solid service offering, and then I wanted to talk to her to feel confident that she wasn't crazy. And then Elizabeth joined, and Elizabeth is my so many things, and my background giggler at the moment. and has many, many skills to offer to the network as well. So anyway, that's the background on how invitations have been working. A little bit of background on things I'm concerned with. I'm very concerned that people have the ability both to spend and to earn. I'm very concerned that people aren't going to be unreasonable during phase 2, right? That a person can be reasoned with. So like, and that's really it. Like, I'm actually not super concerned about people being polite or like non-confrontational, like Elizabeth likes to start fights and poke people and instigate shit. But I also have full confidence that Elizabeth is, you instigate shit. Don't give me that face. But I also have full confidence that Elizabeth will listen to reason and will like fit herself into like a process in a way that's sensible, right? So that's a thing that I'm concerned about in people that are coming into the system. Some things that I'm not concerned about that might be, so this is for me, for phase 1. Things that have kind of surprised people that I'm not concerned about when inviting people. I'm not concerned so much with need. Like, this came up with like the Fremen folks that were in. It's just like, I'm not creating this economic tool for like the unhoused community. I've actually got other designs for economic initiatives and tools to help and bolster ascent from poverty. This tool isn't that tool. And so that's a thing I'm not concerned with. The other thing I'm not concerned with, and this has also been kind of weird for some people, I'm not concerned about diversity. Not of like background and roots. I'm very concerned about diversity of services and goods. Does that make sense? If the whole network were full of graphic designers, that would suck. If the whole network were full of any one thing, it doesn't matter what it is, except possibly gardeners. I think if it was an entire network of gardeners, it would be fine, right? Like, there are a few communities that can do business with each other all day long, and they're stoked. But most industries, most services can't do that much business with each other. So there needs to be a high diversity of skills and goods that are in the basket. So those are my concerns right now with invitations. Are there any other background questions before we get into like the brainstorming or whatever that you would have or anybody would have?
Do you have, so you did vet Brittany, the woman like I brought in that you didn't know. So if that was the first time that you had to do that, and I guess my question is if you have like clear criteria about like who you want in the group. So if diversity of like person, like of race isn't a piece, and it sounds like one criteria is diversity of what you can offer, is that a criteria? And then what are possibly the other ones? So when you were like looking at Brittany, what questions were you asking other than like, is she not crazy? And like, what are her certifications? Because those were the questions that I heard you asked.
Her onboarding was, I guess it was 2 weeks ago now, so I don't remember all of it, but we mostly just had a conversation. And what's interesting is the conversation that I remember having with Brittany was very similar to the conversation I would have with a client if I was onboarding like a new client, right? I want to know that this person just isn't going to be a pain in the ass to work with. And so I just talk to people, and it's not that structured really. It's kind of, if you read any of the like Toyota literature on Nemawashi, well, there are two sides of that literature. Part of it is about like the interoffice, like circulating of like idea sheets, and that's Nemawashi. But there's this other piece that's like this, like hanging out, like talking about where somebody's from, or like whether or not they collected Hot Wheels, and like whatever. And like that's also Nemawashi, in addition to getting somebody's like feedback about a specific proposal. And it's interesting to me that like in Kaizen, those two things aren't considered to be different. They're the same thing. Yeah.
I want to speak to that. In the consensus groups that I've been a part of that have been successful, there's a pattern of being highly welcoming to people, curious about people, like looking to build a relationship as soon as somebody walks in the door, like, what are you all about? That's also part of an anarchist ethic that I've encountered as well. It's like, what's your story? What are you all about? Like, come in, come be involved. But then also active and proactive in that same way of being warm and welcoming around making sure people understand like the context and framework they're about to walk into. So like, for example, oh, so you're wanting to observe this consensus meeting? That's great. We really recommend that for the first 3 meetings or so, you just kind of observe and learn. And then if you have any questions about the process we're using, let me know. And like, here's what the hand signals mean. So just very kind of accommodating in that onboarding phase so that people feel that they are comfortable at those relationship levels as well as at the structural levels with what's going on. So education, training, and information, that like really, you know, being proactive about, do you need more training? Do you need more information? Let me know how I can help you, is something that it's like an explicit cooperative principle that all cooperatives kind of agree to practice when they take on the cooperative identity. So it's something that's kind of foundational in terms of patterns. So I just wanted to mention that.
You said education, training, and information.
That's right.
I tend to.
It's the second part of that, yeah.
And I try to.
Yeah.
So anyways, is it education, sub-list?
Sorry, I'm just first is the relationship building, the like, hey, welcome, like what are, you know, how can we help you? And then the second part is like, what do you need to feel like you can participate? Like, you know, are you supported? Like what kind of information? So for example, we recommend that you just observe the first 3 meetings is one of the ways that we see that show up in collectives. But yeah.
Cool.
So kind of what you were saying about how it can be a casual conversation, but you're kind of still involving them and vetting them on subtle levels. Yeah, you know, just finding out about what they can offer to the network to favor. I imagine that you're generally very like warm and curious, and you're eliciting that in those ways.
Yeah. And I think I want to note about that whole like vetting somebody's like services or goods, like it does not matter to me if I care about their service or their good. Like when I was talking to Brittany, I was like, I'm never going to pay for this at all. Doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be for me. You know, I had complete confidence once I checked all I had complete confidence in the viability of her service offering because there was already somebody in the network asking for it, right? So it's like she fits in terms of the service offering. So then it was mostly about learning about the other things.
That brings up a question for me around onboarding folks with quirky services and who makes the decision on whether or not it is going to be viable or not to the network. Because we're bound to run into that. And so, yeah, right now it's you. And I agree with that. Like you should be able to be objective about it and not like have to need the service directly. Like it shouldn't matter if you think it's valuable to your personal life, but we do need to have some sort of understanding of what a needful service is in order to gauge that.
So let's look at that. The needful, right? Does anybody have any initial thoughts on what should constitute needfulness in a service?
If others have asked for it,
Okay, yeah,
certainly,
cool.
if that came up in their interviews, others who are already in the system.
Okay, what else?
Just quick question on that. Has that been a part of the interviewing onboarding process? You ask what they want?
Yes, so it's actually the last step of the onboarding process is I ask what is your preferred contact information? Like how would you like people to get a hold of you within the network? What do you have to offer that you would like? And it's not just like, what do you do? It's what do you want to offer for favor, right? So like there are some things that I do even that I might not do for favor at this point. I'm not sure. But definitely for a lot of people, there's going to be something they want to offer in favor, something they don't. One of the things I want to do pretty soon here is go around to all the members and ask each of them to offer some very specific thing just in favor. So like Anders and I had this conversation already, and those eggs that he's going to be selling, he's not going to accept US dollars for them. And it's like, that is itself a favor to the Favor Network, to make an exclusive offer. Like, here's the thing I only do in favor. You can't pay me for it any other way, right? And that's, I think, a really cool thing that I'm going to be asking people for. And if anybody can't do that, they don't have anything that can make exclusive, then that's fine. But it would be really great. So I have been talking to people a lot about what they have to offer, but I haven't been asking people with an eye towards ruling anything out because the network's so small, right? If somebody has something they offer that nobody has asked for yet, so what? There are only like 8 people. We'll find that person, you know? So yeah. What else constitutes needfulness? Or what would be an example? Can anybody think of something that we just don't need? And if somebody came into the system and they're like, this is what I do, this is what I want to provide, that we should just say, no, get out.
I like the giggle in the back again.
Yeah, Eliza's great for the giggles. Yeah.
Paramilitary services.
Really?
Yeah, that's kind of the track I was thinking too.
And Deacon goes, really?
I'm out.
Ooh, Deacon.
No, actually, let's talk about that. Why should, okay, first of all, let's talk about the definition of paramilitary services. So paramilitary services, the paramilitary includes all law enforcement, all emergency services. So this is like wilderness search and rescue is paramilitary.
Well, by that definition, I meant just like, extra legal hitman services.
Okay, yeah, I don't want to keep a spreadsheet in Google.
Exactly. I was trying to think
with
of
records
something.
of that. All right, cool. Yeah, I'm down. What about, okay, so could we just expand that to like criminal service, like criminal offerings?
Like drugs.
How do you guys feel about that? Just like everything that is illegal is not allowed in the Favor Network. How would you guys feel about that decision?
Objectively, I think that it might threaten the legitimacy of Favor, but
To make that decision?
yeah, to say no to allow
Right.
the things that are illegal to be used or exchanged for Favor. So there is that problem, but personally, I don't love the sound of it as a protocol or strict policy.
What? Anybody else?
I hear you, Cal. I don't always think that what's legal is what's appropriate, and so it's just it's kind of icky. But I think I agree with what you said, Cal.
Does anyone?
What about sex workers?
So
that's kind of what I was thinking about. Like the main ones that we would probably consider around Favor would be things like sex work or psychoactives. And those two things have strong moral arguments in both directions. And it's not like, if we're going to say that there's nothing illegal allowed, then we're going to run into some structural and class oriented issues there. So that's
absolutely.
I would.
So a couple points to that. One, every member of the network is allowed, like on any transaction, so like it takes 2 members to do this, but there's the transactions column where it's described. Like you have to have an entry that describes the transaction, right? It could be a purchase order number, right?
Yeah, I was thinking the same
PO
thing.
97438. That's the transaction description, right? It's a perfectly valid, it's like a very normal business entry in an accounting book. It's just like, I paid for a purchase order.
I was thinking the same thing. Yeah, there would the criteria would be something like there's well, I don't know if it would even be an explicit criteria so much as an informal norm that you don't describe illegal purchases in the description column of
Right?
your
Yeah, we can't really put that in
transaction.
bylaws, can we? But
Like, yeah, I just sold them this, as opposed to, I mean, people pay for for these things like with cash and with other things, and they just on their ledger book call it different things. So it's really no different than the practices that are rampant with the dollar. So yeah.
Right.
so that being
Yeah.
said, is it still the best decision for us to explicitly state that we don't allow any illegal activity?
Yeah.
If the goal is to like say this is a legitimate way to transact without money, right? So often like alternative currencies get like the system like, well, that's allowing a bunch of illegal activity, and like, yeah, so is the monetary system. Like neither one is clean, but if you're making a counter argument to something that's the status quo, you want to try to keep it clean. Like you don't want to give them an easy way to be like, this is bad. So explicitly saying nothing illegal, on records always saying we're not doing illegal things, but then if somebody like grows shrooms and wants to like use favor for them, just put it as like a purchase order, right? Because then it keeps the rest of the group kind of we're not saying like we're for illegal activity or against, we're just saying officially we're against, so that we can be a model for the alternative that isn't easy to poke a hole in.
Yeah. And there's an interesting thing where it's actually less, like there are some, especially alternative currencies. So this is technically a complementary currency because it can coexist and be co-exchanged with the US dollar. But there are currencies like the Bitcoin, which are not. It's not a complementary currency because it doesn't complement the US dollar because it's too volatile, right? So that's an alternative currency. And alternative currencies, especially if they have anonymity baked into the mechanics of the currency, an argument can be made very directly, like, oh, that encourages illegal activity, right? It has anonymity as in the mechanics of the structure. The favor doesn't. The US dollar, because most of it's not paper cash, but a lot of it is, actually really does incentivize criminal activity and allow it. So it incentivizes it by creating pressure because it's an extractive system. So like any extractive interest-bearing debt-based monetary issuance model creates enormous pressure on people. That in turn promotes people doing whatever they have to get their debts paid, right? So the US dollar incentivizes illegal activity or any kind of activity, whatever is commercially viable. And then secondly, because the US dollar is available in anonymous cash, it facilitates illegal activity. The favor does neither of those, And so that's a big factor, I think, here. That's the thing. Another thing I want to note about specific to sex work is that most of sex work is actually like on the light gray end of the legal spectrum, and there's nothing, and also even like, most, you can't really say most, but a lot of the prostitution that occurs at this point is done technically legally. Prostitution, if you film it and you have a likeness, if you have basically like film contract paperwork, what is that, Caroline?
An appearance release form.
Yeah, appearance release form. So if you have that paperwork in order as a contract for a film, and you shoot
it's
a
not
film,
hard to get that paperwork in order. Yeah.
You get it, just download it. You just download it, sign it, pay the cash. All of a sudden, your prostitution is 100% illegal.
You mean legal?
You mean legal?
Legal. Sorry, yeah, 100% legal. And so, like, in terms of what we encourage, we can, like, the legal system is a fucking mess. I don't even think that we need to, like, tongue in cheek say to people, like, we don't encourage illegal activity. It's just like, no, just do something legal. The government is run by criminals. They have created loopholes for everything you could ever want to do. Like, you want to kill people? Like, establish a paramilitary company. Like, you want to prostitute people? You want to do whatever, XYZ? It's like they have paved the road because,
You're exactly right. I mean, all good points are being brought up here, but the converse is also true. They've created laws against so many things. And
Mhm.
so, like, we brought up those two, or I brought up those two examples that might be something we run up against in the future, but other way more common and also gray area examples would be like designing rain barrel catchment systems for someone's house, or like I forget what the cottage food laws in Colorado are. I know they changed like 5 years ago or something, but
Yeah, in Denver right now, they're good. Both rain barrels and cottage food in general, right now.
well, but
In Denver.
riddled with all sorts of caveats though too, because
Right.
you're allowed 2 50-gallon barrels at your house. What if you install 4 at someone's house? Technically, you did an illegal thing, and on top of that, like Anders selling duck eggs that are unpasteurized are like technically that's also what we would call illegal, and so there's all sorts of hurdles to small business operations like that
Yeah.
we would be up against. And so saying no illegal activity, if you get caught doing this, selling unpasteurized eggs for instance, then you get kicked off of favor. It's like I just don't know if we need to kind of put that legal tape around it.
So you brought up a really great point, which is consequences.
Right.
So if we say we don't authorize, like don't use favor for illegal activity, we could say we throw you out of the network if we find out you're doing illegal shit, right? The other thing we could say is if we find out that something you did was illegal, we reverse the transaction. Right?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Imagine if the dollar worked like that. That's interesting.
Yeah, just that. Just like, oh, we found out that you sold a bunch of drugs. That person has that person has to get a refund or whatever. Or like, like you don't get that money now. We're just gonna take that money and give it back to the person who bought it. They got your drugs and your money. Like I think that would be a great punishment.
I want to read my comment that's in the chat just for the recording sake. So because we live in such a legislative society, like this to me feels like the real consideration here. It's good faith actors being in favor seems critical to its success, not abusing the system and not abusing others in the system. And so we need to kind of discuss what that looks like. How do we vet a good faith actor? And then the other thing is whether someone gets harmed or could claim to be harmed from a favor transaction seems to be the key consideration in figuring out how to protect favor. And that's, again, because of the very legislative, is that the word? Am I using the right word here? The
litigious.
Litigious, thank you. I knew, I was like, that doesn't sound quite right. Litigious society we live in. That's really what I think it comes down to.
Yeah, absolutely. I have been personally quite annoyed by it, but in a mechanical way, I'm kind of in favor of the PayPal policy, which is if someone files a complaint concerning like harm from your service, what PayPal does is sends both parties all the paperwork. Just like, here's the whole record of the transaction. Figure it out. Like,
just the documentation of what happened on PayPal's platform.
As it financially occurred, you both get it, all of it. We're done. Mm-hmm. Because they're not mediators. They don't provide mediation. They're not the government. You can take it to court and you can have a field day with it. And
seems like a good policy to use here.
For PayPal, it's a great policy. When somebody scams you on PayPal, it feels really shitty.
Yeah. PayPal also, I mean, they're just a platform. They're hosting money, but they don't have their own currency.
That's correct.
Yeah. Yeah. So great comment, Caroline. I agree. I think that's obviously like a hinge point for the success of this project. And yeah, you said vetting as far as like how do we vet whether someone can be harmed by something that is transacted. How do we decide that? Do we let the people just decide for themselves? That seems key.
Well, I, for one, am a free market anti-capitalist, and I'm pretty big on the buyer beware ethos of the marketplace. That being said, I actually, that a lot of times when I say things like that, I'm just like, yeah, buyer beware. People are just like, whoa, what kind of like pro big government, pro big corporation kind of attitude is that? And it's like, no. If you think about it, if the market shifted toward people, toward consumers feeling more responsible for their purchases, like consumers believing that if they buy something that's crap, it's on them and not on the person who sold it to them, then how much power would that remove from big companies, from big corporations, from even from the government? Because all of a sudden, if the government's not stepping in on the behalf of the consumer, and big corporations are just like, well, you bought it, whatever, like it's on you, people are going to start to want to do business with people they trust and know, you know? And that is really what I want to encourage, is just like, before you pay for something, especially if it's any significant amount of money, read, ask people, you know, if somebody's selling or selling a service or a good, and you can't find any information on them, ask them, hey, look, the offer you made, this ad I saw from you, it looks kind of cool. I can't find anybody who's ever bought it. Can you send me some references for this good or service? If we're talking about like a decent, like a high ticket purchase, even if it's just high ticket to you, you know, that should be a reasonable request. And if it's not a high ticket purchase, if it's a very small amount of money, then it's a small amount of money, right? It doesn't matter so much. So my personal position is very much, you know, talk to people, engage with people, and take responsibility for the relationship you've cultivated with the person you're purchasing from. And that's the direction I would like to go. That's kind of a political position of mine. And that would be, I think, a reasonable default for the network, right? Now, does anybody have an oppositional position to that?
Yes.
Yes, excellent.
I appreciate what you're saying about like needing to take responsibility as a consumer, because I do think that's super important, that like if you're going to make a purchase, you're making it in an informed way. I also want to respect that there are limitations to that responsibility based on people's capacity and also based on their competence and their knowledge of certain products. And I would say that in a network like Favor, if the impetus is on creating a relationship between each other, then I would want every person that's in the network to almost be vetted and kind of signed off as like, this is someone we trust as competent. Since like I'm offering them my services and I may not be getting services from them, I wouldn't want to be in a position in Favor where, for example, I brought Brittany in, and let's say she worked with you, Deacon, and you're like, her services were subpar and you brought her in. Because now I feel like that's damaging our relationship because I vouched for her and you believed me. Like, let's say you didn't vet her. If it was just that I vouched for her and you were like, great, Elizabeth, I believe you. And then something bad happened. I think that, again, like something like Favor, I think is really dependent on relationships. And when it's interpersonal relationships, there needs to be, yes, like I need to vet people, but also I don't have the time to talk to every person in the network.
Yeah.
I don't want to have that conversation. I don't want to have to Google every single person. I want their presence in the network to be a signal to me that their service is valuable and competent. And if that's not true, if I think that and then it ends up not being true, that actually degrades the kind of like trust I have in Favor. That diminishes my willingness to come back and like do favors so that I like continue to earn favors, right? One bad experience is enough to like get someone out. And so because the stakes are high, because it's a small group, because it's relational, I would want to have something in place that's not just, Elizabeth, make sure you interview each person before you exchange favors. Like, excuse me, I'm already doing them favors. I don't have time to also like individually vet each person. And I need to trust that, like, because Deacon, you made the decision to let them in, that they're not totally incompetent, and that if I ask for what they're offering, I'm not going to get it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the reputation of favor itself is what your comment brings up to me, Elizabeth. That was awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. How many people here have a strong sense for the reputation of Craigslist? Just of a feeling. When I say Craigslist, like if I say, hey, I'm going to meet somebody I bought something from on Craigslist, what feeling do you get inside?
I mean, I
It
feel
sound-
like,
Go ahead. Sorry. Go
sorry,
ahead.
I feel like I have a fairly accurate feeling about that, and it is totally right in the middle. I've had phenomenal, awesome experiences on Craigslist, and I've kept in touch with people that I met on Craigslist, like for transactional stuff, and I've had amazing experiences with that. I've also come to understand that you're dealing with anonymity and like shadiness and people who steal things and resell and do all sorts of weird shit. And Craigslist is like the like it is a cross section of humanity.
Yeah.
And so you're going to get the whole thing. And that
So-
means that a lot of people are going to be acting, they're the bad faith actors, right? So that's how I feel about Craigslist. You go into it understanding this person might be a weirdo. They might be super cool. They might be the best person I've ever met, but it's like you go into it knowing that it's a mixed bag.
Yeah. What about Etsy? Okay. What about eBay?
Yeah. I
Is
feel
it
like
different?
I feel like eBay is different because they have a whole different series of practices around vetting, and you have it's kind of well, you're right.
They don't vet anybody.
Yeah, you're right. It's not vetting, but I mean, it's review based, and so it's what you were getting at with like your free market mechanisms. How if people are bad actors, then they get bad reviews, and then they get less because you don't want to buy from an eBayer who has a 1% rating, especially when someone else is right next to them and they're a 99% rating.
Yeah.
So
In general, people don't buy from eBay sellers that have lower than a 90%
right.
approval rating. Yeah. It's the
So-
same pool of people, right? They're both, anybody can get an eBay account. You just sign up for one. So they're both pulling from the same society, right? And our feeling of the experience with Craigslist, it's a grab bag. You could meet the Dalai Lama on Craigslist and nobody would be surprised. You could meet the scum of the earth. Like, you know, Ted Kaczynski probably has transacted on Craigslist in his past and like sold somebody a cigar box on anyway, sorry, that's a bad joke.
I mean that is a good point, and it's because of mechanisms that are built in.
And it's it's built-in mechanisms. And so
yeah.
I do believe in creating an interface, you know, with photos, with you know, like testimonials, and like there are things that can be done by a system to facilitate just transparency. And with a sufficient transparency and a really like quality interface, this kind of speaks to Elizabeth's point of like not spending a lot of time. It's like there's an like I was talking about like big purchases and little purchases, right? Little purchase, if you don't like the thing, whatever, it was $5. Big purchase, you know, you're buying a house for $200,000. Like there's going to be a lot of conversation involved. But most of what we do is in the middle. It's like this place where we don't want to invest a ton of time, but we also don't want to get ripped off. And so what we want ideally is to have an interface and a system where people can make those decisions with reasonable certainty. That still includes their effortfulness, reading the profile, looking at it. Do I know any of these people that left testimonials? Yeah, I know this guy. They said something good. Cool, I'm in. 30 seconds, right? So if we can facilitate something at that level, I think we're gonna be on the right track.
Has anyone had experience with, I don't actually know if this site is still up, but there was something called Angie's List.
Mm-hmm.
Is that still around?
I think so. Yeah, it's a really interesting model.
Because I was thinking about it when Elizabeth was speaking. Elizabeth, were you just nodding? Like, have you heard of it or used it?
Yeah.
I mean, so that's kind of similar. It's like Craigslist where everyone's been vetted.
It's similar, yeah. Yeah, it's got some very interesting novel mechanics and yeah. That's actually another thing I might want to do an episode on, is just like reputation currency mechanics. Reputation currencies are
Yeah,
fascinating.
that'd be
And I'm
awesome.
interested to see if you can build that reputation currency into favor, because like I am like I've worked with Brittany,
Mhm.
so like I'm comfortable putting like my like approval of her to the test. Like I'm willing to stand behind her and say like I've gotten these services from her. I think she's incredible. I continue to work with her, and I encourage you to. And I feel like that's part of the relationship building within the network, is that like Brittany will feel closer to me because I'm vouching for her. I'll feel closer to her because like my reputation is now tied to hers in a way, right? Like my ability to review objectively is on the line. And then like we're going to continue working together in a way to model like, yeah, like we actually like working with each other. And she can vet me and tell people like, Elizabeth's a great client. like
Yeah.
schedules things, she tells me what's going on, like she gives me feedback, and then that maybe will make other people consider me differently when I go, hey Deacon, I want to be your client. You're like, oh well, Brittany said you're a good client. That should be weighed into your decision about whether or not to take me on.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm thinking about winding this down. So I like to wind things down by zooming out. So if we could spend a few minutes maybe reflecting, like what did people hear tonight that, and I wasn't anticipating like making any decisions about these things. It was great to explore this stuff. Thank you guys for doing that with me. But what did you hear tonight, either about process or about the individual decisions or favor in general, economics, whatever, like that, that kind of moved the, just anything for you? What registered? What are you going to take away? Anybody?
I have a thought, but I'll go last if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll go first. The thing that's going to stick with me is just you wrote it on the board too, the relationships. Like that relationships matter for this favor to work, and then given on your explanation of who's been invited, and it sounds like these are a lot of people that there's been a lot of trust with. That's something just sticking with me. Yeah. Thank you for hosting this and the previous ones, and thank you everyone for being on the call.
Thank you. Excellent.
I can go. I'm realizing one thought is that reinventing the wheel oftentimes doesn't happen because it's really hard to do. Like it's hard to make a better wheel, and it might be useful to look at things that work in this field, like of decision making and vetting and all sorts of stuff like that. That's like Caroline brings a lot of expertise with actual years of experience and lots of wisdom. I think a lot of us might in different capacities, but it seems like yeah, there's a lot here that could be novel, and it could fall apart because it's novel because, you know, whenever someone's tried it, it has crumbled. So yeah, that's a thought that I'm having. I'm also having this thought that couch surfing had a really fabulous mechanism for vetting people. Like actually it worked amazingly. They've changed a lot over the last few years, and things have changed hugely because of things like Airbnb, but couch surfing like is actually really surprisingly similar to what we're talking about.
Yeah, really
in my head at least, because it's like not transactional necessarily. Like you get to rate and review experiences, but there was no like cash exchange, and so therefore it's very different than like an Airbnb, because your free market idea of like, well then you don't go to the ones who have bad reviews. It's like it doesn't matter to the person on couch surfing if they get bad reviews necessarily, because they're not getting any money out of it. You know, they don't have like the same kind of incentive to keep good reviews. So people end up like rising to the top based on just being good people, you know, consistently. And I wonder if favor is going to kind of have to follow that same trend. Like it's just a matter of trust and it's a matter of consistency that people bring to it.
Yeah. I want to throw something out real quick, just as a little direct response, because you made a mention of people having tried things like this in the past, or like maybe people have tried this in the past. Community derived like grassroots currencies have a higher rate of success than restaurants. Everyone believes that restaurants, this particular period in history notwithstanding, are a reasonable idea organizationally. Like it's reasonable to start a restaurant, even though they fail constantly. Community currencies also fail, but less often. And actually many of them have been going for a very long time. One of my favorites has been going since 1930 something, mid 30s. That's the Veer. Free Kipu has been going for since the early 90s. It's amazing. It's global. It's phenomenal. I'm a part of a currency started by Bernard Latier. It's a business-to-business barter currency. It's very similar mechanics, actually. They happen. People start them. They're always heirloom. They're tightly niched to a specific purpose. The ones that succeed, and they do succeed. And I just want to like throw that in to this conversation for anybody like on YouTube or whatever who's made it this far into this conversation. It happens. It succeeds. Look up the Free Kipu, how it saved Japanese Social Security. Look up the Veer Bank, how it rejuvenated the European economy after World War I. Look at the Let systems in France. Look at Totnes, transition Totnes in England. Look at in Curitiba, Brazil, the bus token system that was used to eliminate litter and pollution from the streets of a favela, which is insane. Like heirloom currencies work. I just put in that plug. Okay, next.
I don't want to sound smug, but I feel like I was right about it's not time to brainstorm yet. And to ask people to come up with ideas or to like play with this idea of like even invitation, which we all understand what invitation means. It very quickly became apparent that onboarding people is like its own subject and the criteria is its own brainstorm. And then we got into what relationships look like and what it looks like to work with reputation, right? And so like to me, when you're like trying to brainstorm, like let's brainstorm this one specific thing, if the work isn't done beforehand to determine what are all the things we need to brainstorm, then it very easily gets derailed. Like if the first step of this had been like, you know, what are some concerns you have? And we have a list of concerns, let's pick one and let's talk about that. There's like a step before the step that let's brainstorm solutions about this specific thing, right? And so like, I just feel a little bit like, I don't want to sound smug, but like, I'm also very attached to my process in mediation. And like, one of the glorious things about it is that it understands that like, there's foundation that needs to be built to have an effective brainstorming around solutions. We can brainstorm the topics. That's its own type of brainstorm, but that happens before you pick one and say, what are we going to do about this? Right? Mm-hmm. There's like a process that gets us there. And so I hope to see maybe some of that process. I'm happy to like talk to you about it, but I'd be happy to see some of that before we just jump to like, what do we want to do about invitations? I don't know. What do we want? Like, it felt like such a jarring question out of nowhere. And I want to see more of that, like intentional conditioned setting so that brainstorming solutions is actually effective.
You're right. Absolutely. And I want to invite you to own that you sound smug.
I totally sound smug.
Yeah, like, you sound smug. And
I'm fine with that.
Cool. So yeah, so stop.
I said it. I said this is smug.
Yeah. And yeah, I would totally agree if the idea was to get to a decision about invitations. One of the things I strongly believe in more and more in business mostly and in design is always start before you are ready. One of my favorite designers, Matthew Encina, just made this beautiful video about starting before you're ready. It's really great. I'm gonna throw it in the this will be a bonus for people who are here because I'm gonna throw it in the chat so nobody who didn't make it, is gonna have it. I gotta find it though. But Matthew Encina, if you don't know him, he's this wonderful videographer based out of LA, works for The Future and Blind. He's a creative director. This is me B-rolling while I look for this link.
So could I speak while you're looking
please
for
do.
the link?
Please do.
Okay, cool. I I actually disagree with Elizabeth in terms of I think there was a lot of value in the interactions that were just had, and it's a matter of we are pre-decision making about anything, but that was already known going into this. We were kind of workshopping and making mock, exploring, you know, considerations for a decision just as a mock activity. But this is actually something that many consensus groups overlook, especially when they get burned out on consensus. It's the phase of deliberation. It's the phase of just like laying things out on the table and learning about each other's perspectives about things. How are we orienting to this question? And deliberation, so it's really, really valuable actually in getting to quality decisions. But consensus groups that get burned out, they end up being like, okay, who's got a proposal? Let's go through the procedure really fast because we hate how long this takes, you know, and they end up bypassing really critical process. And this is part of the forming stage of an organization of favor. And so it's all going to be like this for a while. But
yeah.
I think there's a lot of value in it.
That it was a valuable step in the process. I just think that to jump to, and I know Deacon, I know you were just playing and it was like, hey, let's just try this out.
Yeah.
But I think that if you want real solutions, you do need to have more process. I don't want to skip that. And I think Caroline you and I are maybe on the same page about that. And the second thing I want to say is like, I understand starting before you're ready and like business and like when you're doing something on your own. I would say with relationships, there's that quote that I've seen a lot of you like throw around, which is like, move at the speed of trust, right?
Mm-hmm.
And until I trust you, until we have a comfortable relationship, I'm not going to be really willing to enter a decision-making process with you that I am a stakeholder in, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So it is about like, sometimes it's great to jump in. I think in relationships, especially in group dynamics, it's important to take the time to build that connection, build that trust, have an understanding of each other before jumping into a brainstorming process about solutions.
Absolutely. I think we might actually not even be disagreeing here.
Yeah, I don't think there's a disagreement. I just think like for me, like when I heard like, let's play with this, I was like, okay, we're going to play with this and it's going to get derailed and we're not going to be able to stay on topic. And this is going to be just really annoying for me. And like, fine, let's do it. But like, if you do this too many times, it kind of cheapens the actual solution brainstorming process. And then it's like, people get burned out. They're like, I'm done. We've done this 10 times. Now you want to really have a solution, but we already did this 10 times. And now who's going to show up for that actual deliberation?
Well, that was if the expectation was we would get to a decision today.
Right. And there wasn't the expectation, but like, this is the solution we need to find eventually. Right. And if we just spin our wheels over and over again, it's like, oh, we're just playing. At some point, it's like, okay, but if we play this over and over and over again with no intention to actually make a decision, when it's time to make the decision, I'm going to be burned out. I'm going to be like, I'm tired of talking about this. Right.
Absolutely. So in order to not spin this particular wheel over and over again, I will, I'm going to cut that chain off, and also commit to each week for the fireside I try to have a different subject, or it's a slightly different side of what's going on with the favor. So next week we're going to talk about permaculture principles as they relate to macroeconomics, and may also play with some things, and we're going to be playing with things without any real decisions on the table. But it's going to be different subject matter. And Adam's going to be here and going to be kind of leading, or at least bringing the body of experience in terms of doing that work. So yeah, that's what we're going to do. And everybody can, I guess, try to relax their decision-making muscles until the time, because I am dictator, damn it. A benevolent dictator, but dictator, damn it, for the foreseeable future, which I think when I initially wrote the phase 1 plan, I was like, approximately a month. It's like, it's not gonna be a month, it's gonna be like 6 months, because, it is tough. And I always wanna do that. I always try to like say that things are gonna be super fast, but they're not. And that's a personal failing of mine, bad with time. Yeah, Dan, did you want to add anything? You're more than welcome to, in fact, being asked.
I'll just say this was a really interesting conversation, and my internet connection is unstable, so.
Oh, okay.
That's why I keep turning my video off to see if that helps. But yeah, no, this has been really great. This is fascinating stuff. I don't have much of a comment.
Oh, and there goes that unstable internet connection. Okay, cool. So double bonus for everybody that's here.
Bonus, Deacon, where's the video?
Right. I copied in the link, but I never hit enter because I wanted to say something about it. The double bonus is actually, I remembered that the start before you're ready is the first of 3 points that Matthew Encina makes in this video. It's a really good one. He's a brilliant videographer. So if you don't like him, never tell me because I'll think less of you. Does anybody have anything to add before we close it? Are all hearts clear?
Feeling good. It's funny, I can hear howling out of your...
Yeah, it's that time. I invite you all to run outside and howl right now. I'm going to close up the chat. And if you're a howler, yeah.
Thanks for being here, everybody.
Thank you, guys. It's wonderful to see you.
Naveed, I'll hear you in 30 seconds when I go outside.
All right.
Bye.
I thought you meant because the speed of sound or something.
Oh, no, I'm just going to go outside and howl.
No. All right. Good night, everybody.
Deacon, you're awesome.
Thank you.
Love you so much. You're freaking amazing.
Thank you, Naveed.
See you, friend.
See you.